Quite recently, the entire world watched as the Catholic faithful lovingly saw Pope Francis to his final resting place in the Basilica of St. Mary Major. But try to imagine a darker time in history, when instead of such a respectful send-off, a pope's body was dug up and put on trial. Sometimes history can be quite horrifying indeed. In fact, a lot of history is pretty horrifying, come to think of it. The history of the world has been marked by wars and betrayals and disasters, one after another. I can't think of a nation or an institution that, assuming it survives long enough, hasn't been scandalized by something that seems more like it belongs in a horror novel than in a history book. Except that history is often stranger and scarier than fiction. Indeed, the Catholic Church is no exception to this rule. As the most ancient institution still in operation today, spanning a continuous history of 2 millennia, it should perhaps be no surprise that the Church has had some horrifying events in its past. With the passing of the late Holy Father Pope Francis and the imminent Papal Conclave to select his successor, beginning, I believe, on May 7th, 2025, so by the time you see this, it may have already taken place. Regardless, it seemed like now might be a good time to discuss an event from church history that I've actually been meaning to talk about for a while now. Our tale today is about the time a pope dug up the remains of a former pope and put his rotting corpse on trial, even going as far as to perform mutilations of his body. It's an unfortunate event that took place in January of the year 897 and has become known as the Cadaver Synod. Okay, so if we're going to talk about the Cadaver Synod, we need to understand quite a few things about the state of the Catholic Church and the papacy in the 9th and 10th centuries. Unfortunately, due to the intervention of more than 1,000 years, and due to the various political machinations of the time, records are imperfectly preserved, so we only have snippets of context to go on. Which is probably for the best anyway, since this is a horror channel, and as much as I know my viewers generally to be interested in the intellectual stuff, the sooner we can get to the creepy part, the better. But before we get to the really creepy stuff, probably the first thing we need to talk about, briefly, since it's a word you don't often hear outside of Catholic circles, is just what in the world is a synod? Simply put, it's an assembly of clergy to discuss some issue of religious significance. In the case of the Catholic Church, it's generally a meeting of the bishops, although sometimes other priests, lay theologians, or other interested parties might be present. The word has gained a lot of attention recently in Catholic circles in regard to the so-called Synod on Synodality, or more formally, the 16th Ordinary General Assembly of the Synod of Bishops, which supporters have hailed as one of the greatest achievements of Pope Francis's papacy, and paving the way toward a more open and democratic church, and which critics, meanwhile, have derogatorily dismissed as a meeting about meetings, and also have decried the move toward a more democratic church. So they agree on its purpose, but they disagree on whether or not that's what they want to see in the church. But that's neither here nor there. In the context of our discussion, we just need to understand a synod as an assembly of clergy. The Cadaver Synod, in particular, took the form of an ecclesiastical trial, which we'll get to in a moment. The more difficult thing to understand is the context in which the Cadaver Synod took place, because a true understanding of that will require us to delve into a period in the papacy that many Catholic scholars call the Saeculum Obscurum, or the Dark Age, and many Protestants, and even some more blunt Catholics, have taken to calling the pornocracy, a word meaning governance by harlots. And in order to understand that, we need to understand how popes have historically been selected, and how those elections have often coincided with political concerns, particularly during the early decades of the Holy Roman Empire. What we're about to witness this year, in 2025, is a papal conclave. I don't feel the need to go into all the details regarding how that works. If you're watching this video shortly after it's posted, just about every news outlet and YouTube channel in the world is already running a story explaining all the details of the conclave. And even if you're watching in the more distant future, there are other videos that will do justice to the process of papal selection. But just to summarize it briefly, in modern times, the Pope is selected by the College of Cardinals, who meet in the Sistine Chapel and cast their ballots under conditions of extreme secrecy, which is why it's called a conclave. The word conclave means with keys, or under lock and key. Only cardinals under the age of 80 years at the time of the previous Pope's death are considered cardinal electors who will participate in the conclave, out of deference in part, I think, to health concerns of aging cardinals, and also in part out of concern that only people likely to spend at least several years working with the new pope should take part in his election. You don't want somebody casting a vote sort of on his way into the next world without regard to the people who are going to have to live with this guy. Technically speaking, any baptized male Catholic can be elected pope, but in practice, the popes are pretty much always selected from among the cardinals. In fact, the last non-cardinal to become pope was Pope Urban VI in the year 1378. It requires a 2/3 majority of the cardinal electors to select a pope. Thinking of something that's at least sort of adjacent to the horror genre, the recent thriller movie Conclave does a decent job of describing the mechanics of the process, with a bit of artistic license, but they get the gist of it, though cardinals who have participated in conclaves in the past have said the political machinations that drive the plot are entirely unrealistic, and most Catholics have considered the movie fundamentally disrespectful to the institution. But putting that aside, just to get a sense of the mechanical procedure of the conclave, I think it would serve reasonably well. But this is not how it's always been done, and the changing processes by which the successors to St. Peter have been chosen play a direct role in the conditions that ultimately led to the Cadaver Synod. The first pope, obviously, was St. Peter himself, though neither the name of pope nor the title of Bishop of Rome had yet been instituted. Nevertheless, Catholics believe Christ himself installed Peter as the first pope when he said in the book of Matthew, chapter 16, verses 18 and 19, quoting here, "And I say also unto thee that thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. And I will give unto thee the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatsoever thou shalt bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatsoever thou shalt loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." End quote. Protestants may not recognize this necessarily as the institution of the papacy, but Catholics do consider this the institution of the papacy. And therein lies a bit of the problem, because while Christ explicitly elevated St. Peter to stand as his vicar on earth, nowhere in the scriptures is there given a process to elect Peter's own successors. But because Peter worked in and ultimately was martyred in Rome, a tradition began to emerge that the Bishop of Rome would be considered the head of the church. It worked well enough for a short while, as St. Peter himself appointed the next few popes, or his next few successors. Again, the name pope had not yet been invented. And those individuals were Saints Linus, Anacletus, and Clement I. But by the time we get to the fifth pope, St. Evaristus, around the year 100, the church began to have a real problem. This new generation hadn't had direct contact with Christ or the apostles. Bishops of Jerusalem, Antioch, Alexandria, and Constantinople challenged the primacy of the Bishop of Rome and claimed independent apostolic succession of their own. Methods of selecting the popes have varied somewhat through the early church, and at several times contested elections have led to antipopes. The lack of a clear and formalized process also led to various idiosyncrasies in papal selections. During a secret meeting of Christians to elect a successor to Pope Saint Anterus under new persecutions by Emperor Maximinus Thrax, a dove settled on the head of a relatively unknown member of the crowd. This, perhaps understandably, was taken as a sign from the Holy Spirit, and thus Saint Fabian became the 20th pope. His own successor, Pope Saint Cornelius, was elected by a congress of bishops, priests, and the people of Rome. In most other papal elections in the early church, political agents often influenced the elections and pulled the papacy in one direction or other for political gain. In the year 800, Pope St. Leo III crowned Frankish monarch Charlemagne as emperor. Thus, from the ashes of the Roman Empire was born the Holy Roman Empire. Not that any of those words, Holy Roman or Empire, quite describe what they actually created. This may have been a masterstroke by Leo III, gaining significant protection for the papacy from Charlemagne and his successors. However, it also formalized the interference of the civil authority in the papal succession by requiring the emperor to sign off on each new pope. The clergy selected the pope, yes, but their selection had to be approved by the emperor. On the positive side, this formalized cooperation between the civil and religious authorities. But on the negative side, it allowed for significant political influence in subsequent papal selections. Various political factions vied to get their guy on the throne of St. Peter. This, too, led directly to the Cadaver Synod, and we're almost to that point in our history. At this time, there was a rapid succession of popes, averaging almost one per year, as various Roman factions tried to gain or solidify their power. It was in this context that Formosus became the Bishop of Porta in 864 during the pontificate of Nicholas I. 2 years later, in recognition of some work he'd done in Bulgaria, Boris I, ruler of that nation, asked the Pope to appoint him, Formosus, Bishop of Bulgaria, but was denied under a canon law prohibiting a bishop from administering more than one see. Formosus was already Bishop of Porta and couldn't administer another jurisdiction. Not that that particular prohibition was always enforced with equal application. Unfortunately, sometime after Pope John VIII assumed the papacy, Bishop Formosus fell out of his favor for reasons unknown. It is known that John was more of a politician than a spiritual leader, so it must have had something to do with the politics of the day. Regardless of the reason, Formosus fled Rome in fear of the Pope in 875. The next year, the Pope would issue a series of formal accusations against Bishop Formosus, including the plunder of ecclesiastical goods and an attempt to usurp the papacy. No surviving evidence suggests any of it was true, but Formosus was nevertheless excommunicated. John himself was murdered for reasons unknown by members of his own household in 882, leading to the papacy of Marinus I, who quickly forgave and rehabilitated most or all of those exiled by his predecessor, and so Bishop Formosus again resumed his work as the Bishop of Porto. Marinus remained pope only for about a year and a half. His successor was Pope St. Adrian III, a supporter of John VIII. He also died shortly thereafter of suspected but unconfirmed murder, and on that topic it should be mentioned, as I said before, we were averaging around this time about a pope per year, and the life expectancy of these popes was dreadfully short because of all of the political intrigue and assassinations. Anyway, after this particular suspected murder, or at least death, Stephen V assumed the papacy. A brief note here on the numbering of the Stephens. This Stephen is sometimes called the 5th and sometimes the 6th. The undisputed Stephen I was the 23rd pope elected in 254, but in 752 a Stephen II was elected. Unfortunately, he died between his election and his consecration, so some numbering systems include him and others do not. The official numbering of the Catholic Church does not, and so that's what I'm choosing to follow for purposes of this video. After that, another Stephen, who we will call Stephen II, was immediately elected following this incident, also in 752. So anyway, that's why we call the Pope that we're currently talking about Stephen V instead of the 6th, although some people number differently. Anyway, Stephen V was elected to be a conciliatory figure known for his honesty and commitment to faithfully executing his duty rather than playing at politics. But politics were still brewing in the background. After Stephen's death, Formosus himself was elected as the 111th pope. Interestingly, he was only the second individual after Marinus I to become Bishop of Rome, the formal title of the Pope, while also Bishop of another see, which caused some political intrigue. In Formosus's case, that was the Bishopric of Porto. That's not at all controversial to us these days, but it was controversial at the time. Or maybe it wasn't even about bishoprics and religious questions. Maybe it was all purely political. Likely it was all purely political. Despite appearing by all available evidence to be a hard-working pope and generally beyond reproach, Formosus made some political enemies during his pontificate. Guy of Spoleto, king of Italy, wanted Formosus to crown his son Lambert as co-emperor. But Formosus knew that Guy had been plundering the funds of the Papal States, and so he instead favored Berengar of Friuli, who also had a claim to the Italian throne. Though he would eventually give in and crown Lambert, recognizing he was politically outmatched, he dispatched a messenger to King Arnulf of the Eastern Franks, promising to make him king if he assisted in defeating Guy. Arnulf did so in 894. When Guy died and Arnulf subsequently went home, Berengar became the king of Italy, so it all really didn't matter anyway, but it generated some controversy and some political enemies. Obviously, papal geopolitics can get somewhat complicated. One thing worthy of note is that modern scholars don't blame Lambert himself for what was about to happen in our story. Apparently, he and Formosus maintained cordial relations throughout all of this business, but some other members of his family didn't take too kindly to how Pope Formosus handled the situation, and it's generally thought that these events led directly to the Cadaver Synod. All the rest of the background you need to know is that Pope Formosus died in 896 and was succeeded by Pope Boniface VI, about whom relatively little is known except that he was installed to placate the whims of a rioting mob upon the death of Formosus. But he only served for 15 days anyway. It was his successor, Stephen VI, who we need to talk about and who Rupert Matthews called in his History of the Popes, quote, one of the most unpleasant men to have sat on St. Peter's throne, end quote. He does go on to suggest that Stephen himself may not have been as bad as his reputation, but the problem is that he's remembered really for only one thing: the Cadaver Synod. And so we finally have all the background we need to get to the main event itself. Stephen and Formosus were bitter enemies when Formosus was alive. Stephen VI was a strong supporter of Lambert, and while it probably wasn't Lambert himself who urged posthumous retribution, others in his camp certainly did, and Stephen was more than happy to oblige. Stephen, Pope Stephen VI had Formosus dug up in January of 897, a little less than a year after his death in April of 896, dressed him in his papal robes, and brought him to the papal court to stand trial for the original charges leveled against him before his pontificate by John VIII. How can a cadaver, even that of a pope, possibly hope to defend himself in court? Apparently, Pope Stephen VI gave that some thought, and so he appointed a deacon to speak for the deceased Formosus. One might question the adequacy of defense that might be provided by a deacon appointed by the prosecution himself, who happened to be one of the most powerful men in the world, and indeed little is recorded of the deacon playing much of a role in the proceedings, except as a mere formality. With Formosus's corpse propped up on a throne in the Basilica of St. John Lateran, dressed in his papal regalia, Stephen hurled his accusations at the cadaver in the form of questions. "When you were Bishop of Porto," he is recorded to have said, "why did you usurp the universal Roman see in such a spirit of ambition?" Later commentators have added what are almost certainly apocryphal embellishments to the story. According to an article on the Cadaver Synod by one Emilius Soth, one such commentator wrote that, quote, "The stones themselves, execrating such a monstrosity, then cried out with their own voice by knocking against each other, that they would more willingly suffer spontaneous ruin than that the Roman Church should remain so depressed by so great a scandal." You might think that story is too remarkable to be believed, but there might, believe it or not, be a hint of truth to it. File that away for later and we'll come back to it. Pope Stephen VI didn't seem much to care about the stone's protestations, nor about the lack of any evidence any scholars have found to suggest that poor Pope Formosus ever did anything wrong. As you might expect from a trial in which the defendant was a disinterred corpse, the outcome was a foregone conclusion. Stephen found Formosus guilty, had him stripped of his papal vestments, and then cut off the 3 fingers of the right hand Formosus and any pope would have used for blessings. The desecration of Pope Formosus's corpse might seem bad enough to modern secular ears, but to the players in this drama, it would have been a particularly grave desecration. The Catholic Church, even today, but especially in the past, has a long history of venerating the relics of her saints. And while Pope Formosus is not one of the 83 popes formally canonized as saints, the Church takes the sanctity of human remains quite seriously. There's a view that through their relics, the saints and other holy people can continue to be a part of the Church community. Indeed, even today, almost all Catholic churches have at least one relic enshrined in their altars, and some churches have a lot more. That hasn't been a requirement since the reforms of the Second Vatican Council, but it is still encouraged, and most churches do still have them. In fact, if I could pause our story for just a moment, I should also mention that even I have some third-class relics in my own collection of curiosities. This is a medal of St. Padre Pio of Pietrelcina, which has been touched to a first-class relic of the same saint. Only first- and second-class relics are officially recognized as holy relics of the Church. Those are either body parts of the saint or objects closely associated with the saint's life. But there's a long tradition of informal veneration of third-class relics like these as well. The whole story of Padre Pio and how these relics came to be in my possession is found in the 2nd volume of my Case Files of the Rocky Mountain Paranormal Research Society book series, to which you can find a link conveniently right down there in the What's It. While we're paused, and while you're checking out the What's It, I suppose now is as good a time as any to remind you that it would be quite helpful indeed if you were to click that thumbs up button and leave me some comments. And do also subscribe and ring that notification bell so you don't miss out on any of my other videos about horror, both in fiction and in real history. All very much appreciated. But returning to the Cadaver Synod, what we have to realize is that Pope Stephen VI didn't just want to find his predecessor guilty on paper. His acts of desecration were specifically intended to prevent the possibility of any future veneration of Pope Formosus' remains. And he didn't just strip off the papal clothes and chop off the fingers. No, he went a step further, ordering Formosus' body to be unceremoniously dumped into the Tiber River. This was an additional insult because that's how the Romans historically treated their political rivals and some of the early Christian martyrs. Accounts vary as to exactly what happened to Formosus next. Some say his body washed up on the banks of the river and was recovered from there. Others say his body was spotted and hooked and recovered from the flowing water, either by a fisherman, a monk, or a group of good nuns. The most extraordinary reports suggest rumors circulating around the time that the now waterlogged body was still performing miracles at this time. Regardless of all of the details, his remains were recovered and moved to a place where they could be treated more respectfully. The legal outcome of the Cadaver Synod was that Stephen VI expunged all the actions taken by Pope Formosus. Ironically, this would have included his own ordination as bishop, but he didn't seem to care too much about such details. He even went as far as to order that all other bishops who'd been ordained by Formosus had to subject themselves to his own authority for reappointment, which he only granted to those who condemned Formosus' memory. The people, however, did not take kindly to the Cadaver Synod, as you might expect and hope, and the outcome was not what Pope Stephen likely expected. Remember the claim from a few minutes ago that the very stones themselves started rumbling in protestation of such a scandal? Well, later that year, there was indeed an earthquake that completely destroyed the Basilica of St. John Lateran, where the Cadaver Synod was held. Of course, the building was rebuilt and still stands today as one of the 4 papal major basilicas, but it's actually been destroyed and rebuilt a few times throughout its more than 1700-year history. Obviously, that earthquake didn't take place during the Cadaver Synod itself, as that earlier quotation from a commentator might have suggested, but the local faithful, either simply distraught at the treatment of Pope Formosus, or perhaps even thinking the earthquake was a sign from God that the Cadaver Synod was too great a scandal to ignore, rose up and took matters into their own hands. Pope Stephen VI's pontificate came to an inauspicious end when he was thrown into prison and later strangled to death within his cell. That mostly brings the story of the Cadaver Synod to an end, but we should finish off with some bookends to bring the story to a more satisfactory conclusion. It's not entirely clear whether the next pope was elected only after Stephen's death or merely while he was in prison, but either way, his successor was Pope Romanus, who served only 4 months before abdicating to live as a monk. His successor was Pope Theodore II. He also served for less than a month before his death, in which, once again, foul play could never be ruled out. But during that time, his one noteworthy action was to completely undo the Cadaver Synod. he called a new synod which completely countermanded everything Stephen VI had accomplished against Pope Formosus. He rehabilitated all of those who'd been removed from their offices by Stephen's order, and even ordered those who had been reappointed by Pope Stephen VI to burn the documents related to that process, holding that their original appointments by Pope Formosus were the valid ones. As for Pope Formosus himself, Pope Theodore II ordered his remains to be disinterred once more, but respectfully this time, and reburied in the tomb in St. Peter's Basilica from which he'd been improperly removed almost a year earlier. The next successor, Pope John IX, continued the process, convening another synod to again annul the findings of the Cadaver Synod and to burn its documents. Symbolically a powerful statement, though my inner historian wishes the documents had been preserved for study. But in an attempt to make peace, he pardoned the individuals who took place in the Cadaver Synod as long as they confessed they only did so under duress. One of only 6 men to refuse this pardon was Sergius of Cerveteri, who would later move on to become Pope himself, because apparently the Cadaver Synod is the story that simply would never end. At least one thing ended for good during John IX's pontificate. His synod banned for all time the trial of dead bodies. Unfortunately, probably as much ill as good ultimately came from the Cadaver Synod. While its own findings were annulled by subsequent popes, the various political machinations in this period in history ushered in what's come to be known as the Saeculum Obscurum, Latin for the Dark Age. It's also been called the Pornocracy, or the Rule of the Harlots. It sprang directly from the papal chaos following the Cadaver Synod, beginning with the election of the very same anti-Formosus Pope Sergius III in 904, and lasting until the death of Pope John XII 60 years later. This is generally considered the lowest point in papal history, with the possible exception of the Cadaver Synod itself, which helped lead to it. During this time, the popes were largely installed by and subject to the influence of the wealthy and corrupt Theophylacti, a powerful Roman family descended from Theophylactus I, Count of Tusculum. Theophylactus's own daughter Marozia became the concubine of the 45-year-old Pope Sergius III when she was just 15. She would later arrange for the murder of her former lover, Pope John X, to see the elevation of her current lover as Pope Leo VI. Later still, she would guarantee the installation of her own son, John XI, who was rumored to have been fathered by Sergius himself. In fact, one argument is that not only did the chaos following the Cadaver Synod lead to this period in papal history, but that the Theophylacti gained power specifically by using the Cadaver Synod through their known ally Stephen VI to discredit their rival Pope Formosus. Obviously, they didn't have total control at that time like they came to enjoy during the period of the Pornocracy, but that seems like a plausible explanation to me. And if I can put on my metaphorical tinfoil hat for a minute, I might even muse that it's worthy of suspecting they may have had something to do with the suspicious death of Theodore II. And thus ends the story of the Cadaver Synod, proving once again that history is at least as bizarre and often much more terrifying than anything us horror writers can dream up. And this also ends our video for today. Do be sure to like, share, leave a comment, subscribe, and ring my bell if you haven't already. That way you won't miss out on any of my other videos in which I review horror books and horror movies, discuss horrific history, or talk about anything else creepy and or spooky. But most importantly of all, until we meet again, take care and stay scared.